What is up, everyone? It's Quinn here, and in today's video, I'm going to be going through my Week 17 top 36 wide receiver rankings. Hopefully, that means you guys have made the Fantasy Football Championship. Congratulations on that. I've already posted my running back rankings. I'll also have the quarterbacks, tight ends, and defenses coming out today. And if I'm being honest here, with this wide receiver video, it kind of felt depressing going through these wideouts. The wide receiver ones, very solid. You're getting into like your higher end wide receiver twos. They look good. Feels like once you're hitting your mid tier wide receiver twos, there's a big fall off. And then you're getting into your wide receiver threes, and it is just gross. There are very few like wide receiver threes that I'd be firing up into my lineup with a lot of confidence. And it's not even like a talent issue. There's just a lot of wide receivers in weird situations. There's a lot of quarterback injuries that are potentially holding back these different players. So I think it'll be interesting, especially later on. But let's dive right into tier one. Not a ton of controversy with these guys. Puka Nacua, JSN, Jamar Chase, and Amon-Ra St. Brown. I do just want to run through the stat lines of Puka's last three games because what he has been doing has just been absurd. So his last three: 7 for 167 and 2 touchdowns, 9 for 181, and then 12 for 225 and 2 touchdowns. The dude is amazing. I do think at this point he should be considered the wide receiver one. You could certainly make a case from a real life perspective also, but he's just playing at such a high level. And then the other guy I'll point out in this tier, Amon-Ra St. Brown, he did not practice on Monday with a knee injury. He plays on Christmas, so Thursday night. Something to monitor there. As of right now, I still have him in tier one. If he's playing, he should be a lock in your lineup, but you're just hoping he can give it a go. Now, moving into tier two, I'll start it off with the Cowboys wide receivers, CeeDee Lamb and George Pickens. It's a good matchup here for both of these dudes. Commanders ninth in points per game allowed to the wide receiver position. George Pickens had a nice bounce back in week 16, 9 targets, 7 receptions for 130 yards and a touchdown. Two very talented wide receivers in a great offensive situation with a plus matchup. Then I've got Chris Olave going up against the Titans, and I'm just really happy for Chris Olave. He's someone who has been in just really rough situations pretty much every year of his career. He had the very serious concussion concerns last year, and he's just a player that I believe in. He was very talented. I liked him as a fantasy pick this year, and it was never a talent issue, right? It's just, can he get supported in the environment around him? And especially later on in the season, second half with Tyler Shuck taking over, the answer is yes. Last 2 games, 6 for 85 and a touchdown, and then a nuclear week 16, 10 for 148 and 2 touchdowns. He scored at least 14 PPR points in 5 of his last 6 games. Tyler Shuck looks promising. Chris Olave, we always knew the talent was there. I think he's a mid-tier wide receiver one this week. Also a solid matchup going up against the Titans. Then I've got A.J. Brown going up against the Bills, and he's also been awesome as of late. Last 6 games, 19.8 points per game. He's seen at least 10 targets in 5 of his last 6 games. The targets bounced right back in week 16 after I think only 2 targets in week 15. It's not the best matchup against the Bills, but A.J. Brown's going to be a wide receiver one. Then I've got Drake London, who made his return to the lineup coming back from that knee injury in week 16. It was an underwhelming game, 8 targets, 3 receptions for 27 yards. I obviously still believe in the player. He's been a fantasy wide receiver one. It's a good matchup against the Rams, who are allowing the 7th most points per game to the wide receiver position. So Drake London, still a top 10 guy for me. And then my last tier 2 wideout, Nico Collins going up against the Chargers. Now, this is not a good matchup. Chargers, 5th fewest points per game allowed to the wide receiver position. The Texans are all the way down at 19 implied points. But you're just kind of looking at this offense, and the run game hasn't been great. I think it's going to be tough sledding here against the Chargers. There's not a ton of weapons outside of Nico Collins. I believe in the talent. He's a great player. He is going to be my wide receiver 10. Now, moving into kind of a smaller tier 3, I'll start it off with T. Higgins going up against the Cardinals. He came back in week 16. I want to say this production was all very early on in the game. Like, it looked like it was going to be a big T. Higgins performance. He ends up just finishing with 3 receptions for 53 yards and a touchdown. But I think the Bengals are going to put up points here against the Cardinals. This defense is really struggling. Bengals offense coming off a great game. They're first in implied points, up at 30.25. So T. Higgins, nice back end wide receiver one. Then I've got Jameson Williams going up against the Vikings. just continues to produce. These are his last 4 games: 26.9, 17.3, 26.4, 12 PPR points. He's seen at least 9 targets in all 4 of those games. He's really just had the one bad performance since Dan Campbell took over play calling. Now, this Vikings defense is pretty tough, but with Sam Laporta out, Campbell as the play caller, also Amon-Ra potentially banged up, I just think Jameson Williams is a great option. Then I've got a couple of veterans here, Mike Evans and Cortland Sutton. For Mike Evans, had the great return right in week 15, 12 targets, 6 receptions for 132 yards. Came back down to earth a little bit, still a fine fantasy day. 9 targets, 5 receptions for 31 yards and a touchdown. This Bucs offense has been disappointing. I talked about it in the running back video. Like, I do think this coaching staff just across the board is going to be gone, barring some sort of crazy playoff run, which seems very unlikely at this point. The wide receiver room's got a weird committee vibe to it, but the usage for Evans himself has been fine. He's a very good player. It's a decent matchup here against the Dolphins. And then my last tier 3 wideout, Cortland Sutton, going up against the Chiefs. He's had big back-to-back games, 7 for 113 and a touchdown. Then this past week, 6 for 86 and a touchdown. I do think the Broncos are going to put up points. Maybe the passing volume's not crazy because there's such huge favorites in this game, nearly 2 touchdown favorites, but I still like Sutton as a very high-end wide receiver 2 option. Now, this is where the wide receiver position starts to feel a little bit sketchy, and you've also got some players here affected by potential quarterback injuries that I'll touch on. But I'm going to start off this tier with Jawan Jennings going up against the Bears. He's put up 18 PPR points in back-to-back games. He's just consistently getting into the end zone, 7 touchdowns in his last 7. Then I've got Tetairoa McMillan going up against the Seahawks. Had a weird 3-game stretch of just low volume performances, not commanding targets at a super high level. He had a nice bounce back, 10 targets, 6 receptions for 73 yards and a touchdown. Just such an impressive young rookie wide receiver, expecting there to be some decent passing volume here in a trailing game script against the Seahawks. Then I've got Jalen Waddle going up against the Buccaneers. Quinn Ewers made his NFL debut as a starter. I thought he looked fine, looked very good in the first half, kind of fell off a little bit in the second, but it was a fine Jalen Waddle game. 9 targets, 5 receptions for 72 yards. Fine mid-tier wide receiver 2 play. Then I really struggled trying to figure out where I was going to have Justin Jefferson. This has been an issue over the last few weeks, right? You're balancing the talent versus the situation, kind of accepting that the production hasn't really been there. And he finally did have a bounce back game, commanded 8 targets, caught 6 passes for 85 yards. On paper, this is a great matchup this week going up against the Lions, who are allowing the second most points per game to the wide receiver position. But you've got McCarthy banged up. You have Max Brosmer, who looked brutal, right, in his one start this season. And so it's just this weird position. I will say I've got some wide receivers later on, like Isaiah Flowers, Terry McLaurin, guys who are lower because of potential backup quarterbacks. If those guys have their quarterbacks, I would push them ahead of Justin Jefferson. I think anywhere between mid-tier wide receiver 2 to very high-end wide receiver 3, I think is a fair range for Justin Jefferson. After him, I've got DJ Moore going up against the Niners. We'll have to monitor the wide receiver injuries, so Luther Burden, Rome Odunze. But DJ Moore, the volume hasn't been crazy, but back-to-back big games, 4 for 69 and 2 touchdowns, 5 for 97 and a touchdown. I mean, I will say, it wasn't looking like a great fantasy day before they go into overtime, right? But he ends up having that, amazing deep ball catch touchdown that, leads to a big fantasy performance. So I still don't think he's a can't-miss player in your lineup, but if those wide receivers continue to miss time, not super scared of this 49ers defense. We saw Phillip Rivers having some success against them. I think DJ Moore is a nice wide receiver too. Then I've got Jacoby Myers going up against the Colts. Great matchup. Colts third in points per game allowed to the wide receiver position. The Jaguars are expected to put up points, 26.5 implied points per Vegas. And then I do view Jacoby Myers as their number 1 target. I think there's a lot of cooks in the kitchen, right? Like BTJ will make an appearance later on. You've got Parker Washington, who's coming off a huge game. You've got Brenton Strange. You've got Travis Etienne out of the backfield. They are spreading the ball around a lot, but Jacoby Myers still feels like that stable, high floor option in this wide receiver room. And then the two guys I mentioned with quarterback questions, Zay Flowers and then Terry McLaurin. So Zay Flowers has actually looked great over his last 3 games, very productive, 20.6, 15.8, 21.2 PPR points. It's just a question of, is Lamar Jackson going to play? If Lamar does play in this game, I'd probably bump Flowers up. I honestly think I'd have him maybe right behind Juwan Jennings. Like, I do think I put him over McMillan. I do think I put him over Jalen Waddle. So keep that in mind if Lamar does play. And then for Terry, I think he probably rises to a similar spot if Mariota's good to go, because this is a great matchup against the Cowboys, who are allowing the most points per game to the wide receiver position. It's just, I do think there's a real fall off from Marcus Mariota, who's like a very strong, like top tier backup option compared to Josh Johnson, who's like career journeyman, like QB3 on most of the teams he's been on. So that's the difference between Terry being like a higher end wide receiver 2 to more of like a back end wide receiver 2 play. And then the last guy in this tier, Wan'Dale Robinson, going up against the Raiders. Now, this might be an overreaction to just a grotesque passing performance in week 16, because Wan'Dale had been super consistent prior to week 16. It's a good matchup. Raiders allowing the 10th most points per game to the wide receiver position. But man, with Daboll gone, it does really feel like the Giants have just kind of neutered Jackson Dart in this game. This is the full game. This is not a half, a quarter. 7 for 13 passing for 33 passing yards, 0 passing touchdowns, and a pick. That is not supporting anyone. That is that would be like the Wan'Dale Robinson stat line from last year on his own, 7 receptions for 33 yards. That is pretty brutal. I do think he's going to be significantly better this week, but still, it's not a high bar to one up, 33 passing yards out of your starting quarterback. Now, moving into tier 5, these are like our very back end wide receiver 2s, high end wide receiver 3s. I'll start it off with Devonta Smith going up against the Bills. The production hasn't been great. He's gone for 50 or less receiving yards in his last 4 games, but the talent is there. These Eagles weapons kind of go on their own runs of like when they're productive, right? Like A.J. Brown, really rough to start off the season. He's been great as of late. Goddard had that run early on. Then he had like kind of a rough middle of the season. He's logged a few solid games in a row. It just feels like this is kind of like the downturn part of the season for Devonta Smith. Then I've got Stephon Diggs going up against the Jets. And I don't think there's like a tougher wide receiver to rank just based on like usage volatility than Stephon Diggs, because it's very easy to look at his performance in week 16 and be like, oh, he should have been ranked way higher last week. He's a super talented wide receiver. He's paired with Drake May. And you look at his usage and it's like, yeah, if I knew he was going to have an 80% route rate, he would have been ranked way higher. But it's like the Patriots just will randomly give him like real wide receiver 1 usage, and then he'll just completely settle back into like 50 to 65% route rate, which is pretty unplayable like we had seen in his previous 3 games of scoring under 6 PPR points. But when you give him an 80% route rate, he's going to catch 9 passes for 138 yards and have a huge fantasy day. So you're just kind of taking the swing. Like, is he going to have great usage against the Jets, or is he going to fall back down? I really don't have a great read on it. I think, though, if the usage does slip in this matchup against the Jets, like, it is an opportunity for him to produce better than he would with that usage in like some tougher matchups. So for me, wide receiver 25 is where I kind of settle in here. Then I've got Troy Franklin going up against the Chiefs, and a lot of this is just due to Pat Bryant being hurt. I mean, that was a vicious hit that he took at the end of that, was it the Jaguars game? Yeah, that was tough. Obviously not expecting him to play this week, but with Pat Bryant kind of out of the picture, and we had seen this early on in the season where Pat Bryant hadn't fully broken out, earned his role, Troy Franklin's usage had been really strong, getting those wide receiver 2 routes. Even in his last 2 games, he's been productive, 6 for 85 and a touchdown, 4 for 66. Like I talked about with Sutton, I think they're going to put up points. Troy Franklin, high-end wide receiver 3. And then the last guy in this tier, I've got Rashee Rice. Now, there's no guarantee he plays this week. Missed week 16 with a concussion. They play on Christmas, so it's a quick turnaround. And the offense is terrible, right? They're implied 12 points. Gardner Minshew now also out for the season. Believe they're going to be rolling with Chris Olodokun. So, like, not even someone who's in the ether as like, oh, this is a consistent, like, known backup entity in the NFL. And so it could be very ugly. I just think for Rashee Rice, he's someone where in a game that they're not going to have a ton going offensively, they're going to be trying to get the ball to Rashee Rice. He can work out of the slot. He can make some plays after the catch. And so, like, within this system, I think he's fine in this range, but certainly not a ton of confidence just given, like, the offensive floor and lack of ceiling here with the Chiefs. Now, moving into my sixth and final tier, I'm going to start it off with Michael Wilson. And this overall is just like a very weird tier. You've got a lot of talented wide receivers that are just kind of in like sketchy situations, sketchy offenses. So for Michael Wilson, I also have Marv in this tier as my wide receiver 32. This was an underwhelming game out of both of these wide receivers. I believe they combined for 6 total targets. Michael Wilson at least brings in like that circus touchdown catch where he was very fortunate the ball didn't hit the ground, but he ends with 2 receptions for 52 yards and a touchdown. You are hoping for more volume going up against the Bengals. The Bengals actually statistically have been pretty tough against opposing wide receivers. It seems like it's just because they give up. First off, they're probably in a lot of just like rough game scripts, so the passing volume isn't crazy, but also they just give up an absurd amount of points to the tight end position. So in terms of pass catchers, I guess they do skew more heavily towards tight ends, but I still think this is a good spot here for these Cardinals pass catchers. It's just like the Michael Wilson thing is so odd where he looks like Jerry Rice when Marvin Harrison Jr. is out of the lineup, and then when he's back in, he just like completely sinks back into like mediocrity. After Wilson, I've got Christian Watson going up against the Ravens. Obviously, there's quarterback question marks here. I will say, like, if Jordan Love gets cleared and plays this week, I would bump Christian Watson up. I think he'd probably be in tier 4, honestly, like probably behind, or I don't know, like in that Flowers, Terry, Jacoby Myers mix. He's looked great with Jordan Love at quarterback. I do think Malik Willis is like a very capable backup. He came in, he looked really good, but there's just so many mouths to feed. Christian Watson really does kind of rely on efficiency, that big play upside, and I do think that's lessened, at least through the passing game, if Jordan Love misses. Then I've got Ladd McConkey going up against the Texans. I still question if I should have Ladd even ranked this high. Like, he had a fine week 16, but 4 receptions for 43 yards and a touchdown. There's just been very limited upside. Also a bad matchup against the Texans, who are allowing the second fewest points per game to the wide receiver position. I've actually got 2 more year 2 wide receivers back to back. This has kind of been like an underwhelming bunch this year from these 3, but I've got BTJ. He's had a couple of solid games since returning, a couple of dud games. I do think if he were to have a boom performance, it would be this week against the Colts, who are 3rd in points per game allowed to the wide receiver position. I do think, though, like, this is just the role that BTJ has kind of settled into. They tried to use him as this all-around wide receiver early on in the season. They wanted him running routes over the middle of the field, and he was terrible at it, right? He had a lot of drop issues. He was making some business decisions. It just straight up looked like he was scared catching the ball over the middle of the field. And so they've kind of settled him into like, all right, you can stay on the outside, you can run deep, you can have a high ADOT, but just with that role, you are very reliant on like one of those huge plays. You're not going to have, the consistent volume. And so the floor is very low, which is why he's here at wide receiver 31. Then I've got Marvin Harrison Jr., kind of mentioned him with Michael Wilson. In his return, it was rough, 3 targets, 1 reception for 14 yards. I do think there's a bounce back opportunity here against the Bengals. Then I've got Chris Godwin going up against the Dolphins. And this is going to be half Chris Godwin talk, half depression over Emeka Egbuka. So Godwin's been fine in his last 4 games, 10.8, 10.5, 14, 8 PPR points. Nothing crazy, but he's not going out and like sinking you with his performances. He did lead all Bucs wide receivers in routes in week 16, which is great for Chris Godwin. Unfortunately, Emeka Egbuka is not going to be in my rankings because his usage has really fallen off a cliff, and I do just think it's a mistake. Like, I'm not going to come out here and say Emeka Egbuka has been amazing as of late. He hasn't. He's had some drop issues, very uncharacteristic of him. Coming in as a prospect, he was just viewed as like the super safe, reliable option. That hadn't been the case in his last few games, especially prior to Mike Evans returning. But his quarterback play has also been straight up bad, and like specific to Emeka Egbuka, like his catchable target rate was so brutal. And now you've got like Jalen McMillan running more routes than him. Like, I'm sorry, to me, that's pretty inexcusable. I know Todd Bowles is the defensive coach. I just think this entire coaching staff is going to be gone Bulls had actually done a decent job of like becoming more aggressive, not being as passive in terms of like, really going for it on like fourth down, stuff like that. It really seems like he's just completely shelled up as of late, talking about how they just need to control the game with the run, and you're not even going to use Bucky Irving optimally, who I talked about in the running back video. But the vibes are just bad here with the Bucks, and so Ibuka not going to be in my top 36. Chris Godwin just barely makes it based on his usage. Then I've got Deebo Samuel going up against the Cowboys. Great matchup, like I talked about with Terry. First in points per game allowed to wide receivers. Hopefully he's getting Marcus Mariota. It hasn't been pretty as of late, though. Under 8 PPR points in his last 3 games. Then I've got Quentin Johnston going up against the Texans, and he does feel very volatile, right? Like the floor has been very low this season, but he's coming off a great performance, 5 targets, 4 receptions for 104 yards and a touchdown. And when I was kind of looking at all these Chargers weapons, and I was like, who's like the couple last wide receivers I'm going to throw in here in an offense where I'm obviously a huge believer in Justin Herbert. There's a lot of mouths to feed. And so I'll take a swing on QJ, who I think at least has that big play upside where he doesn't need to catch, 7, 8 passes to have a great game. He can have one big play that makes him like warranted as a flex in your lineup. And so I think that's what you're banking for in this matchup here against the Texans. And then the final wide receiver I've got is Adonai Mitchell going up against the Patriots. In his last 4 games, he has put up 24.2, 3.4, 17.4, and 17.3 PPR points. So the production has been pretty volatile. 33 targets in those last 4 games. I will say, I think it was his first like legit game getting reps on the Jets against the Patriots. He had a really rough game. The funny thing was that he actually did a great job getting open. He completely burned Christian Gonzalez on a play deep, just completely dropped it, had another really bad drop. So the drop issue showed up, but in terms of like him actually getting open, it was a decent game out of him. At this point, right, it's slim pickings. There's not a ton of great options, so he will be my final player. And that is going to wrap it up for my top 36. Stay tuned for the quarterbacks, tight ends, defenses coming out later today. Running backs have already been posted. Thank you all for stopping by. Drop your comments down below, questions. I'll try to get back to you as soon as I can. Thank you again, and I'll see you in the next one.